Charlestown State Prison, Massachusetts, April 1947. Malcolm Little, inmate number 22,843, stood outside Warden John O'Meara's office, hands cuffed behind his back, flanked by two guards. He'd been summoned, no explanation, just a note slid under his cell door at 6 a.m. Report to administration, 0900 hours. Malcolm's mind raced through possibilities. Someone had complained about the books. Someone had reported him for something. Maybe they were moving him to solitary. Maybe they'd found the letters he'd been writing. In prison, a summons to the warden's office meant trouble. Malcolm had been incarcerated for 11 months. Before that, he was Detroit Red, a street hustler who could barely write his own name. Now he was something else, something he couldn't fully name yet. For the past 6 months, he'd done something no one expected. He copied the entire dictionary by hand. Every word, every definition, page by page. The warden knew, the guards knew. Malcolm just didn't know what they planned to do about it. The office door opened. Warden O'Meara sat behind his desk. Malcolm's copied pages spread in front of him. He looked up. His expression was unreadable. "Sit down, Little." Malcolm sat, and then the warden said 7 words that changed the trajectory of his entire life. "You're leaving this cell, effective immediately." Malcolm Little arrived at Charlestown State Prison in February 1946. He was 20 years old, sentenced to 8 to 10 years for burglary, but everyone knew the real reason for the maximum sentence. He'd been caught with stolen property, yes, but more damning in the eyes of the Massachusetts court system, he'd been in a relationship with a white woman, Sophia. The judge had made it clear. A black man with a white girlfriend deserved the harshest punishment the law allowed. Malcolm walked into prison full of rage, not the productive kind, the destructive, directionless kind that eats you from the inside. He'd grown up watching his father murdered by white supremacists, his mother institutionalized after a mental breakdown triggered by poverty and racism. He'd survived by hustling in Boston and Harlem. Numbers running, drug dealing, pimping. He'd learned to survive by being sharper, faster, more ruthless than anyone around him. But he'd never learned to think, not deeply, not systematically. He could hustle, he could charm, he could talk his way out of almost anything, but he couldn't articulate why the world was the way it was. He just knew it was broken, and he was angry about it. The first 3 months in Charlestown, Malcolm was a problem inmate. Loud, defiant, refused to follow orders. Guards called him Satan because he cursed religion, mocked authority, started fights over nothing. He spent weeks in solitary confinement for assaulting another inmate who disrespected him. The isolation should have broken him, the tiny concrete box, the silence, the complete deprivation of stimulation. Instead, it gave him time to think without distraction, time to sit with the rage that had been driving him since childhood, time to realize that anger without direction was just self-destruction in slow motion. And that's when he met John Elton Bembry. Inmates called him Bimbi. Bimbi was 41 years old, serving time for burglary, but he was unlike anyone Malcolm had ever encountered in the criminal world, self-educated to a level that surpassed most college graduates, articulate in a way that commanded respect not through volume or threat, but through the precision of his thinking. Bimbi ran informal classes in the prison yard, standing on a bench, teaching history, philosophy, current events to anyone who would listen. Other inmates listened to him the way people listen to professors, taking mental notes, asking questions, treating him like an authority. Malcolm watched from a distance at first, skeptical and defensive. What good were books in a place like this? What would philosophy do against concrete walls and steel bars? But curiosity won over cynicism. One afternoon, Malcolm approached Bimbi after a yard session and asked a question that had been bothering him since childhood, the question beneath all his rage: why do they hate us so much? Bimbi didn't give a simple answer. He never did. Instead, he asked Malcolm if he'd ever read about colonialism, slavery, economic systems built on exploitation and maintained through psychological domination. Malcolm admitted he hadn't read much of anything. Bimbi didn't judge. He just handed Malcolm a book from his cell. "Start here." It was a history of African civilizations before European colonization, kingdoms, universities, mathematical advances, architectural achievements. Malcolm took it back to his cell that night. He opened it with a mixture of defiance and hope, and he couldn't read it, not really, not in any meaningful way. Malcolm Little had dropped out of school in 8th grade. He could read at a basic level, enough to survive on the streets, but complex sentences, academic vocabulary, historical analysis, it was like trying to read a foreign language. He'd get through a paragraph and realize he didn't understand half the words. He'd have to reread the same page 5 times and still miss the meaning. It was humiliating. Here he was, a man who prided himself on being sharp, and he couldn't comprehend a simple book. He could have given up, gone back to cursing, fighting, wasting time until his sentence was over. But something in Malcolm had shifted. Maybe it was the isolation. Maybe it was Bimbai's example. Maybe it was the realization that ignorance was its own kind of prison, one he'd been living in long before the court sentenced him. Malcolm decided he needed to fix the problem at the root. If he couldn't understand the books, he needed to understand the words, and to understand the words, he needed the dictionary. The Charlestown Prison Library had one dictionary, a massive, worn Webster's with thin pages and tiny print. Malcolm checked it out and brought it back to his cell. He started reading it, just reading, a page a day, trying to absorb definitions, but nothing stuck. His mind wasn't trained to retain abstract definitions without context. That's when he had the idea. If he copied the words by hand, wrote them down physically, maybe they'd stay in his brain. It was tedious, it would take forever, but Malcolm had nothing but time. He requested paper and a pencil from the prison administration. They gave him a small allotment, assuming he wanted to write letters. Instead, Malcolm opened the dictionary to page 1 and started copying. Letter A, aardvark, a nocturnal burrowing mammal of sub-Saharan Africa. He wrote it down, every word, every definition. He didn't skip anything, not the pronunciation guides, not the etymology, not the example sentences. If it was on the page, he copied it. The first week, Malcolm copied 20 pages. His hand cramped so badly he had to shake it out every 30 minutes. His eyes strained under the dim cell light, a single weak bulb that barely illuminated the page. The other inmates mocked him relentlessly. Detroit read writing a book. Satan turned into a scholar. What you gonna do with all them words, Red? Write your way out. Malcolm ignored them. He'd learned in the streets that mockery was just fear disguised as laughter. By the end of the first month, he'd copied 100 pages. His handwriting had evolved from crude scrawl to something neater, more controlled. He started to notice something extraordinary. Words he'd copied days earlier were appearing in the books Bimbai loaned him. And now when he encountered them, he didn't just recognize them, he understood them. Not just the bare definition, but the usage, the nuance, the connotation, the feel of the word in different contexts. By the second month, Malcolm had developed a sacred rhythm that structured his entire existence. Wake at 5 a.m. before the guards made their first rounds. Copy for 2 hours before breakfast while the cell block was still quiet. Copy during yard time while other inmates played cards or basketball. Copy after dinner until lights out at 10 p.m. Then illegally copy by matchlight or moonlight until exhaustion forced sleep. The dictionary became more than an obsession. It became a spiritual practice, not because he was trying to impress anyone or prove something to the guards, but because for the first time in his 21 years on Earth, he felt his mind expanding in real time. Every new word was a precision tool for thought. Every definition was a window into concepts he'd never had language for before. Hegemony, dialectic, exploitation, sovereignty, emancipation. These weren't just abstract terms. They were keys to understanding the invisible systems that had crushed his father, institutionalized his mother, ghettoized his community, and criminalized his existence. By the fourth month, guards noticed Malcolm's behavior had changed. He wasn't starting fights anymore. He wasn't cursing. He was quiet, focused, almost monastic in his discipline. One guard, Officer Davies, stopped by Malcolm's cell during a night check. Malcolm was hunched over his small table, copying by candlelight. "What are you doing, little?" Malcolm didn't look up. "Educating myself." Davies laughed. "You copying the whole damn dictionary?" Malcolm finally looked up. "Yes." Davies stopped laughing. He leaned closer to the bars, looking at the stacks of filled pages. "Why?" Malcolm's answer was simple. "Because I was ignorant, and ignorance is a choice." Davies walked away without responding. But the next night, he brought Malcolm extra paper. He didn't say anything, just slid it through the bars and left. That small act of recognition mattered more than Davies probably realized. It meant someone saw what Malcolm was trying to do. Someone understood that this wasn't just about serving time. It was about transformation. By the 6th month, Malcolm had copied the entire dictionary from A to Z, over 800 pages of handwritten definitions, etymologies, pronunciations. His handwriting had improved. His vocabulary had exploded. But more importantly, his understanding of the world had fundamentally changed. He could now read the books Bimbai gave him without struggling, philosophy, history, political theory, religion. He devoured them. He started writing letters to Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, whose teachings Bimbi had introduced him to. His letters were articulate, thoughtful, searching. He was no longer Detroit Red, the ignorant hustler. He was Malcolm Little, a man constructing an intellectual framework for the rage he'd always felt. But the warden had noticed too, and that's what led to the summons. Warden John O'Meara was a career corrections officer, 30 years in the system. He'd seen thousands of inmates pass through. Most fell into categories: the violent, the passive, the repeat offenders who'd be back within a year. Malcolm didn't fit any category. O'Meara had read the reports. Inmate 22,843 had gone from disciplinary problem to model prisoner in 6 months. No fights, no infractions, just books and handwritten pages. O'Meara had requested to see what Malcolm was writing. When the guards brought him the copied dictionary pages, O'Meara sat in silence for 20 minutes, reading. This wasn't a man killing time. This was a man rebuilding himself from the ground up. O'Meara had never seen anything like it. He'd seen inmates take classes. He'd seen men find religion. But he'd never seen someone teach themselves with this level of discipline and hunger. It unsettled him, because he understood something most people didn't want to acknowledge. Malcolm Little was more dangerous now than when he'd arrived. Not physically, intellectually. A man who could educate himself to this degree, who had this kind of willpower, was someone who couldn't be controlled through the usual means. Fear didn't work on him anymore. Ignorance didn't contain him. O'Meara knew he had two choices: punish Malcolm, try to break this momentum, force him back into the box of a typical inmate, or acknowledge what was happening and give him space to continue. O'Meara chose the second option, not out of kindness, out of respect, and maybe a little bit of fear. You're leaving this cell, effective immediately. Malcolm's face showed no emotion, but his mind was screaming questions. Leaving the cell meant what? Solitary, transfer to another prison, release. That was impossible. He still had years on his sentence. Warden O'Meara continued. You've been approved for transfer to the Norfolk prison colony. It's a different kind of facility, experimental. They have a library with 10,000 books, debate programs, education classes. You'll have access to resources you don't have here. Malcolm still didn't speak. He was processing. Why would the warden do this? O'Meara seemed to read his thoughts. I'm not doing you a favor, Little. I'm doing what makes sense. You've outgrown this place. You're not a typical inmate anymore, and frankly, keeping you here is a waste. Norfolk has structure for men like you, men who want to use their time. He paused. Don't make me regret this. Malcolm finally spoke. I won't. O'Meara nodded. You're dismissed. Malcolm stood. Still cuffed, still flanked by guards, but something had shifted. The warden hadn't said it explicitly, but the message was clear. Malcolm had earned something, not freedom from prison, but freedom of mind, and in some ways that was more dangerous. Malcolm transferred to Norfolk Prison Colony in May 1947. The difference was immediate. Norfolk operated on a progressive model. Inmates had more freedom of movement. There were educational programs, a full library, even visiting scholars who gave lectures. Malcolm threw himself into it completely. He read 10 to 15 hours a day. Philosophy, history, linguistics, religion. He joined the debate team and became one of the best debaters in the prison. He continued his correspondence with Elijah Muhammad and deepened his understanding of the Nation of Islam's teachings. Dictionary he'd copied by hand became the foundation for everything that followed. Those 6 months of copying weren't just about learning words. They were about learning discipline. Learning that transformation is possible through relentless, unglamorous work. Learning that the mind is the only territory you fully control, even in a cage. By the time Malcolm was paroled in 1952, he was unrecognizable from the man who'd entered Charlestown 6 years earlier. Detroit Red was dead. Malcolm Little, the uneducated hustler, was dead. What emerged was Malcolm X, one of the most articulate, intellectually formidable voices of the 20th century. The legacy of those 6 months lives in every speech Malcolm gave, every debate he dominated, every interview where he intellectually dismantled opponents. People often asked Malcolm later in life how he became so well-spoken, so knowledgeable despite limited formal education. He always gave the same answer. I educated myself in prison. I copied the dictionary by hand, and that dictionary opened every book I read after. The story became legendary, but what people often miss is the emotional truth beneath it. Malcolm didn't copy the dictionary to become famous. He copied it because he was desperate to understand why the world was the way it was. Desperate to escape the mental prison of ignorance, desperate to become more than what the world expected him to be, that desperation, channeled into discipline, became his greatest strength. The warden who transferred him to Norfolk probably never understood the full implications of that decision. He saw a man who'd reformed. He didn't see a man who would challenge the entire structure of American racism, who would speak to millions, who would force the country to confront its lies, all because he'd been given access to books and the discipline to use them. In 1965, the year Malcolm was assassinated, a reporter asked him if he had any regrets. Malcolm thought for a long moment. I regret the years I wasted in ignorance, but I don't regret prison. Prison gave me time, time to stop running, time to read, time to think. If I hadn't gone to prison, I might have died in the streets as Detroit read, never knowing I was capable of more. The dictionary Malcolm copied by hand no longer exists, lost to time or perhaps destroyed, but the transformation it represents lives on, because that's what education is, not the accumulation of facts, but the radical act of becoming someone new, someone capable of seeing the world clearly, someone dangerous to systems built on lies. Malcolm X understood that, and he spent 6 months in a cell, copying word by word, teaching himself freedom. The warden opened the door, but Malcolm had already unlocked something more important, his own mind.